Well, I want to thank all of you for coming tonight, and it has been a long dream of mine to be able to come to Bergen and to this church, which we've learned about over the years and how important it is. We have good friends in Jarle and his family, whom we have been connected with for some time, and we have received such a nice welcome from him. Last night he gave us a Christmas dinner. So we feel very important and very well welcomed indeed, and we're very pleased about that. And I also want to give thanks to your pastor and what that actually means and what he has done here. That was a great lecture, and I want to see if I can't build on some of that. But Pastor Bigstad, we thank you for your welcome here as well, and for all that you have meant in the church. One of the great things about being able to come to such an event is that wherever you go in the world, and you come to meet Christians like this, you immediately have a family there. And even if you cannot speak the language as you should, we nevertheless have this bond immediately. You know that it is often rather lonely to be in the church, and you often feel this way. One of our great teachers used this as the headline of his book, The Lonely Way, the Lonely Way, Herman Sasa. But we don't feel so lonely then when we come to this particular kind of group, and I'm very thankful. You've also heard that I come with colleagues and friends. So you've heard about Jim Nestigan, and all of you know Jim. Now you know that he's my teacher. That means that if I say anything that offends you, he is to blame. So you go to him. We also have our great friend Michael Albrecht here, who's our pastor. Wherever we travel with a pastor. You never know when you might fall into sin. You have to have a pastor along with you. I recommend this when you travel anywhere you go. So we bring Pastor Albrecht with us as well. I feel the need to apologize before I really begin. I don't know if this is the last remains of my Norwegian heritage or not, but I wish I could speak to you in Norwegian. You know, this is what I still consider my mother language, but you also know something about what happens to us when we go across the pond. We have to lose our language. And my family on both sides, my mother and father, came from areas here in Norway. But they came in the 19th century, and over the years we have lost the language. So I have to apologize that I come and speak to the people that I consider my family, and nevertheless I cannot speak to them in Norwegian. I am sorry for that. I'm actually tracing some of my family. Some of you may be able to help me. Part of our family are Pedersens that come from Fana, so very near here. And we're trying to locate some of them. The rest are from, I will not pronounce this properly, but from Trungen Church near Telemark. They're Helgesens. Now I have to be a little bit careful because I think that on both sides of my family they left because they were in debt to people. So I hope I don't owe any of you money, but you have to come and check with me if that is the case. But I will speak to you now in English, and I give thanks that you are so gracious to hear me this way. Now, I also happen to be beginning a sabbatical year. So in my sabbatical year, I won't be teaching regularly in classrooms as I normally do. And that means that I'm sitting down and writing. And what I'm writing is a book on Luther's teaching regarding the hidden God. Now, this is not exactly fun business to sit down and write about the hidden God, but nevertheless, in part of my preparation for coming to speak to you, I wanted to use some of the material I'm already working on. So I'm going to change a little bit the title of my lecture that I want to give tonight. It will not be about God as a lion, but it is rather going to come from the story of Moses in Exodus 3 and 4. And the title of the lecture is Moses, the Bloody Husband, which is going to be talking about God when he is operating outside the law and what that experience is like. I think I can build on Pastor Bigstad's work as he's describing the way Luther began to teach about the human being, and especially when it comes to this matter of the bound will. Now, another word before I get started. I'm going to spend time, as most of us speaking will spend time with you, talking about Luther's Bondage of the Will. You've already heard that that book was very important to Luther, and he put it alongside the catechisms, which is no small matter, as most important to read. So I actually want to find a way to commend this to you, so that you will begin looking at this text whenever you can. I use it for evening devotion. Now, this is rather surprising for those of you who have read through this particular text, but I want to convince you that this is really devotional material. When you get up in the morning, I want you to use your small catechism, just as your pastor taught you. But in the evening, then I want you to open up the Bondage of the Will and read from it in this particular way so that you'll hear how it is that Luther is speaking. The genre of the book is usually called a debate, and debates are not usually very devotional. But Luther's book, The Bondage of the Will, is really not a debate. It is actually an exercise in pastoral care from Luther. And when Luther is exercising his pastoral care, he's never better. This is where you really want to listen to him. He is giving health care. This is before single-payer government health care. Luther had to provide it to Erasmus, who otherwise was not getting it. And Luther especially is giving the kind of health care that has to be applied to the soul. Now, we've heard already the soul is not a separate part from the body. But here we want to talk about that great Lutheran tradition of care of the soul or cure of the soul that usually has that German word Seelsorge associated with it. Luther is using that in the Bondage of the Will. He's actually applying care of the soul to Erasmus. Because the first thing you need to do in pastoral care is have an ear so that you hear when somebody is suffering and in need. And Luther knew that Erasmus was suffering and in need. And somebody had to put him out of his misery. Well, Luther volunteered. No one else was going to do it. Erasmus was one of the most widely known people in the world at the time. And nevertheless, he was in deep trouble, and Luther knew it, and Luther actually began to address him in this way. This is why he says, I hope in this text, in these words, your soul can actually hear now what I'm saying. And he is going to speak to Erasmus in this particular way. This is what has to happen with teachers of the church who deal with people who are in great need, who otherwise don't have a preacher. I did this one time with our president, the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, who was in a little bit of trouble, for those of you who know something about this. And he was in need of curing of the soul. And I knew, being a good Baptist as he is, that what he needed was a Lutheran. So I sat down and wrote a letter to him, identifying how it was that I know that he had come upon hardship in his life and he actually needed a preacher. And since no one else seemed to volunteer, I stepped forward. Well, I'm still waiting to hear back from him. Luther never quite heard back from Erasmus either. Nevertheless, now we are hoping that something will take hold. By the way, if any of you are worried that I am unfair politically, I offered the same help to President Bush. I haven't heard anything there either. But what do you do as a preacher? You offer this particular kind of care and help when you know people are in need. Now, what you do when you are working with the care of the soul is that you have to diagnose the problem. This is what our pastor is helping us with, diagnosing what the problem of the human is. And Luther now pinpoints Erasmus's problem. He diagnoses the problem of the soul that Erasmus has, and he gives it a name. He says it very clearly. Erasmus, your problem is uncertainty. Uncertainty is your problem. He even says it this way: for uncertainty is the most miserable thing in the world. There is the greatest suffering. The greatest suffering is to be uncertain. And to be uncertain now means that you are going to either turn inward in the self, incurvatus se, or you are going to get a preacher who is going to come and begin to heal you from the outside, as we say. So Erasmus was trying self-cure. He was trying to cure himself of this. And when he's writing back to Luther, part of this is self-cure. This is turning back upon the self. My parents grew up rather poor, and rather than get some of the more expensive medicines, they would try self-cure. And this never worked. This was not a very good and healthy sort of thing. So we would have old home remedies made of various types of tea. It never cured a single thing. And it was not going to work for Erasmus either. Erasmus was trying self-cure, and this is the way Erasmus tried to cure his uncertainty. He used a slogan that came not from Scripture, but came from the greatest of all philosophers, Plato. And Plato used a word now that Erasmus tried to apply to himself. That is, what is above us is no concern of ours. This is what Erasmus now tried to take and apply to himself, so that when he was uncertain about important things regarding God, he would apply Plato's words to himself and see if it helped. Therefore, what he tried to do was say, if you are troubled in your theology, then just quit thinking about it. Just don't bother yourself with it. And what sort of things did Erasmus suggest we shouldn't be bothered with? Well, listen. He says, does God predestine anyone? I don't know. Just forget about it. Just turn away from it. Or how about this? Is there a Trinity? Erasmus says, I don't know. Let's just turn away and forget about it. Or how about this? Does Jesus Christ have two natures in one person? He says, I don't know. These things are too difficult for us to grasp. I'm just going to ignore the problem. Those are things that are above me, and therefore I am going to ignore them. Then he got to the one that he was really after, and Luther is finally going to treat him on. Do I have free will? Erasmus now is going to say, well, you know, when it comes down to it, In Scripture and in life, I don't know. I'm uncertain. But in uncertainty now, I'm going to use Plato's principle and just say, if you don't know for sure, it must be something that you don't have to know, definitely, and just set it aside. Ignore it. Don't worry about it. We have an old song, a pop song in the United States that goes, "Don't worry, be happy." Well, this is Erasmus's medicine. Well, how well does this work? Well, it never works. This never works this way. And Luther knew precisely what the problem was. So Luther says, I know that your problem is uncertainty, but you don't double down on the uncertainty, saying, it's all right, I don't need to know if God is triune. I don't need to know if Jesus Christ has two natures. I don't need to know if I have free will. Instead, now, I'm going to set all of that aside. Luther says the only solution to uncertainty is certainty. That's the only solution. And the only way that you are going to get certainty now is if you get a preacher who will stop you from turning inward upon yourself and trying to self-medicate. And so Luther did this. Right at the beginning of his treatment with Erasmus, he breaks off and he says, Erasmus, I acquit your heart. I'm going to now give it its more accurate translation. I absolve your heart. How do you like this? And so he turns right in his text to Erasmus and says, I know what your heart needs. It needs a good absolution. And somebody's going to have to step out and say it, and who else would possibly do it? Who would have the chutzpah to do it but Luther himself? And so he turns and precisely gives this to Erasmus, and there he says it in the only way that Luther could say it. He says, I absolve your heart, you hog of the Epicurean herd. Beautiful. It's one of the best absolutions I've ever heard. Now, I don't know if I can recommend this in the liturgy for the pastor to speak to you in this particular way. But Luther knew who he was dealing with, and he says, I know you, you hog of the Epicurean herd. I now am going to acquit your heart. Well, that's pure Luther. And I can understand why he looked back on it years afterward and said, you know, that's not bad. That's the way you actually speak in this particular way to a person who doesn't have certainty. And what do we need certainty about? Because you're going to notice immediately when I start talking to you about the matter of the hidden God, we enter into the question about all of the things that we're uncertain about. And there are going to be many, many things that we're uncertain about. We will acknowledge that. We'll address it. We will recognize this. The Christian life is full of uncertainty. You do not know the direction that your life is going to go in one way or another. It will turn this way and turn that way. In this way, you have uncertainty. That is absolutely the case. But in one thing, you want to have certainty. And this is where Luther now goes with Erasmus. He says, what we need certainty in is the answer to the question that was troubling Erasmus and finally troubles us all. It is, what does God think of me? Now, again, I don't know if this is my Norwegian heritage or not, but I spend way too much time thinking about what other people think about me. You know, I'd like to give this up, feel a little freer, and so on. But when it comes to theology, this question about what does God think of me always hovers in the conscience. It comes back over and over again. No matter how you're self-medicating, trying not to have this question come in, the question comes in. And Luther now says to Erasmus, that question, what does God think of me, is not above you. You must think of it. You must Bring it into consciousness. And in doing this now, you also have to understand how finally the answer is given. Luther now takes another step. The answer to the question, what does God think of me, cannot be known as long as you have no preacher. If you have no preacher, that question cannot be answered. And it will trouble you. It will eat away at you. And what Luther now begins to lay out in the rest of the Bondage of the Will is what it means for your life to have no preacher and then to get a preacher. He is going to say all of theology has to be laid out in this way. So in theology, you either have to know whether you have a preacher or not, and the difference between those two things is not just going to be the difference between night and day, it's going to be the difference between death and new life, eternal life. And in that way now, that distinction is going to become the great and important distinction of all theology. This is why I hope I'm not out of place to say that I have heard your pastor enough to know that I don't think you are paying him well enough. You don't realize what it means now to actually have a preacher come into your life, since not everyone has such a thing. And in this way now, the difference between having a preacher and not having a preacher is the difference between having certainty in the one thing that is necessary for you to live life freely. What does God think of me? Otherwise, you're going to be spending all of your time spinning your wheels, wondering what the answer to this is, including when people secularize, that is, when they become atheists, that is, when they say they have no belief whatsoever. This problem doesn't go away, it actually increases for them. And the increasing of it is part of what Luther identified in Erasmus. Erasmus is the first great secularist, and Luther actually saw this. He could see it projected. He saw what was going to happen in Norway and in Minnesota. Well before it was going to happen, he actually saw it take place in Erasmus, and he knew how it had to be addressed. So he addresses it now in the only way he can. He had to become a preacher to Erasmus, so that Erasmus was no longer left with uncertainty, but certainty. Now, certainty, when you get a preacher, assumes two things theologically. The first thing that it assumes, this is what we call the Doctrine of God, for those of you who like to take notes. So now I'm at the point where I can be a systematic theologian. That's my area. And if you don't know what that is, neither do I. But what I'm going to say next is exactly that. It's systematic theology. And it here is talking about what we mean by the doctrine of God. And in the doctrine of God, two things are necessary for you to have certainty, which comes not in your inner powers, but from the outside with the preacher. These two things are, first of all, knowing that God is all-powerful. We confess this in our creed. So when we say in the first article of the creed what we believe about God, how do we say this? We say, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, or creator of heaven and earth. And that little word almighty is the word that I'm after right here. God is almighty. It was the first thing that was actually confessed in the creed. The other ones were added later. Father and Creator were added as kind of bookends. But what stood in the center was the one that was absolutely necessary. God is all-powerful, almighty. That means no one can thwart God's will. No one. No matter how strong and how powerful they appear. No one can thwart his will. I said there were two things. The first is the teaching of the almightiness of God. The second is to know precisely what his will wills. If God's will is powerful and cannot be overcome by any other will, then what do we need to know? What does he will? What is this will of his that no one and nothing in the cosmos can overcome? Here, his will is very strange. The strangeness of his will is that he puts all of his power into the mouth of the preacher in the form of a promise, which is then bestowed and given to you, which will tell you the answer to the question, what does God think of me? And when you get that answer, what does God think of me? Then you will have what God's will is. He wants you to know the answer to that particular question. This is why pastors begin in their work to learn what baptism is, which is a promise that cannot be thwarted. And in that way, we can then turn to what I intend to work with a little bit in Exodus 3 and 4, Moses, the bloody husband. So believe it or not, all of that was just preface. That was supposed to be a 5-minute preface. I got a little bit long-winded. Here now is how we set up the matter of how it is that God is actually going to give us his will in a way that we didn't expect. It's going to come to us in a way that first frightens us and even offends us, and then it is going to be a great freedom that opens up to us. One of the best ways to teach this, I think, is in the story of Moses, the bloody husband. And for this, I can tell you where I am going to conclude and then spend a little time filling it in for you. My conclusion of all of this is that the first hard-won lesson that we need for tonight is that God, or if we want to be more specific, the will of God, is not finally the law. I'll even say this more briefly. God is not the law. Now, this takes a great deal of learning, because the way that we operate in theology, and this is truly because of what we mean by sin, we always want to put into God's will the form of the law, and God finally is going to operate outside of that law. That's where I'll conclude. But now let me see if I can lay this out a little more fully. Well, I am a preacher myself. I don't know if you noticed, but I'm going to start now with the text. Not yet Exodus 3 and 4. I want to start with one of the summaries of Scripture, which for my purposes here is going to be found in Psalm 105, verse 6. O offspring of Abraham, his servant, children of Jacob, his chosen ones. Now, what do I want here? This is a beautiful promise. It is full of joy. It is an announcement. And nevertheless, when we look closely at it, it is going to have 3 hard truths about divine election. They are, first, God chooses, you do not. This is the first shock to our will. Second, God chooses some and not others. In this case, he says, offspring of Abraham, children of Jacob. Third, and here's the bitterest pill to swallow, God chooses apart from, and finally even in opposition to the law. God is not the law. His choice of persons is not legal, and it is not even just according to the teaching of the law. Now, this is going to cause a series of problems for us because here we are immediately in the greatest and most difficult decision or discussion of all theology, what predestination and divine election actually mean. And we have to go right into the middle of it. Luther knew this, into the bondage of the will, and so he was going to take this head on. That is, Luther begins using language that is very offensive to us. All things happen by absolute necessity. One of Luther's great quotations, which he is using here to actually heal Erasmus from a problem he has. Remember I said Erasmus had a health problem. He had a problem of the soul, and that is that Erasmus, by saying what is above us is no concern of ours, was trying to cut off things that you should not think about. But he did describe what he thought you should be thinking about. So he says, Trinity, that's too hard. You shouldn't think of that, because then your head will boil up. It will break. So don't think of things like that. Don't think about things like, do you have free will or not? That's too hard for you. So Erasmus says, but I will tell you what you should think about. The one thing that is beneath you, that you can handle, that is something that even lay people can handle. And Erasmus had he thought very little of lay people. He says, the one thing you should think about are what he calls the precepts of the moral life. That's what you should be thinking about, which is another name for the law as it functions in your life. This is what you should be thinking about, and as long as you think about that, you are going to have the best chance you have of being elected by God. I don't know if he'll finally choose you, but that's your best route. That's your best chance. And when you do this in this particular way, what Erasmus is doing now is making God's will itself into the form of the law. And in this way now, he has his disease of the soul. Election, by sitting and thinking about divine election, how God chooses, whom God chooses, and so on, is very troubling. But Luther says, you have to think of this. It will come up in one way or another. The more you attempt to block it off, the worse this will actually get for you. What we want to do now is look very directly at it and not try to steer away. And in particular, Luther suggests that we don't follow the old path that the church taught. That is, that if you had to think about divine election, the best thing you could do is prepare yourself hoping for the best. This is what we would call this. So I'm going through my life doing my moral precepts, and I'm hoping for the best on the final day, but I can never be certain or sure about this, and therefore you have to prepare yourself in case on the last day God looked at you and said, you didn't do enough. In which case then you were to look God in the eye and say, well, I am very sad to be damned to eternal damnation and damned to hell. However, I see your point. You have a good reason for doing this. And that's all I need. If you give me the good reason for rejecting me and even giving me eternal damnation, I can learn how to accept it. By the way, this is one of the great teachings of Augustine. And Augustine always sat on the edge of this tightrope, saying that what the Christian does is prepare himself so that if God damns you at the end, you say, well, whatever you say, I'm on board with. I'll agree with you, as long as I know the reason and the rationale. Now, what do you suppose is the place everyone goes for the reason and rationale, in case they shouldn't make it? Well, the law. And there, what you are doing is telling yourself, I will try to do this law, but if in the end I'm not chosen, then at least I know that God is just and right, and he has damned me for a good purpose. We actually have a name for this in the United States. We call this being a Norwegian bachelor farmer. This is what we call being a stoic. The Norwegian bachelor farmer can go out on the farm and lose an arm, but he won't miss any work. He'll just keep going. And nothing is going to stop him no matter what. And the whole idea of the Christian life is to become that Norwegian bachelor farmer, so that no matter what happened, even if God damned you in the end, you'd say, well, I don't exactly like it, but I can take that too. When we're in another part of the country, we call this having a strong Presbyterian disposition. So that you're going to take this one way or another. And in this particular way, that is how you are going to arrange your life and prepare for the final day. But here, now, we have to watch how God is going to operate in a very different way. He is not going to use the law to elect you. Now, this is a great shock to us, especially when we think, I won't like it if he damns me, but at least I know that he has rules, and if I didn't follow them properly, well, then I'll take the penalty. I'll take whatever I have coming. But in this case now, God is not going to give you the law as the means of your election. In fact, now, he is going to give the law in such a way that it elects no one. This is what Paul now means in Romans 3 when he says, all have fallen short of the glory of God. Not one. If you're depending upon the law as your way of being elected, you have no luck at all. All of you are now going to be in the same boat. All of you will be Norwegian bachelor farmers, but you are not going to be able to take it in the end. And in this particular way now, we begin to see how it is that the law itself was never given from the very beginning to save you, to elect you, to be the thing now that was actually going to accomplish having God turn to you and say, I want you to know exactly what I think of you. You are mine. I have claimed you. You belong to me. And when God does this, he is not going to be operating according to the law. He is going to be operating outside of the law. I still think the best example of this is Moses. I'm finally there. So now let's take a look at Exodus 3 and 4. You remember that God called Moses in Exodus 3 out of his father-in-law's flock. He was being a good Norwegian with just a few goats, a few sheep. And then he told Moses, go down, Moses, to Egypt land. And there now Moses was taken out of the flock and made what we call a preacher. Now let's watch what happens. How God elects or chooses this way and how he's operating. Moses really had a very decent life for himself. He had married a Gentile by the name of Zipporah. I suppose for some of you this would be like marrying a Dane. This is a little outside the norm, but we're going to try this. So Moses now goes out and actually marries outside of the group, right? And he was having a very fine time tending his father's flocks. He wasn't intending to go anywhere else. And suddenly he saw a flame of fire coming from a burning bush. The flame caught Moses' attention for the same reason that we are fascinated by God's hiddenness. That is, the bush was not acting as a bush should act. Now, how should a bush act? Well, if a bush is on fire, what should happen to the bush? Well, it should be consumed, and it should actually go away. But it was not consumed. It did not go away. It was not operating according to the normal laws of physics, and now it caught Moses' attention. So he went over, and what happened next was even more surprising to Moses. He was looking at this burning bush, which was not being consumed up, but just kept going and going and going, and lo and behold, it talked to him. This was even worse. Now, most bushes will not talk to you. And here the bush begins to talk to him. And when it talks to him, it says something that was very frightening to him. It used his name. The bush knew his name. Well, this is getting quite strange. And Moses now is outside of what we call the comfort zone. And now he is not sure how this is all going to work for him. But this is the way God works with his election. You watch how this happens now. So, out of the bush came the voice. It said, Moses, Moses. Moses perked up. And what do you say when a bush that is burning talks to you and says your name? Well, this is what you say. Well, here I am. What do you want? All right. This is Exodus 3:4. Now God had warned Moses not to come too near, because the unholy cannot get too near to the holy. If the unholy gets too near to the holy, what will happen to them? Well, they will burn up. So he warns him, you must now take off your shoes. Now we have to do something to go back to the Catechism of Luther. This is the third commandment on Remember the Sabbath, where Luther lays out what we actually mean by holy. You remember that the rest of the world distinguishes holy and unholy simply by using the law. If you do the law, you're holy. If you do not, you're unholy. That's what we mean by the difference between holy and unholy. Luther corrects this in his small catechism. The third commandment, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Then he says, what is this holy? The word makes a thing holy. So when God calls a thing, that word makes it holy. And when you hear such a word, you should not be afraid of it, but you should gladly hear and learn it. And in this way now Moses is going to be introduced to the third commandment, which is not even yet on tablets, but he is actually going to be told how it is that he and others will become holy as well. Now, God tells him to take his shoes off. He comes nearer, and now God is going to speak. And instead of sounding like the law, God's voice now sounds very different. It does not say, Moses, I saw what you were doing last night and I'm not happy. This does not say this. Instead, God says, I have seen the affliction of my people, and I have heard their cry, and I have come down to deliver them. Now, this is a word from God, but it is not the law. That is the gospel. And the gospel comes in the form of a promise, and the promise tells you about deliverance from evil, sin, and death, not on account of the law, but because God is merciful. When Luther starts to learn this himself and turn around to teach it to Erasmus, he starts teaching Erasmus the difference in God's will between the law that demands justice and the mercy of God that operates outside of justice entirely. And when God operates outside of justice this way, he does what we call salvation or deliverance. This is actually called God's proper work, not his alien work. One of the great teachings that comes from Luther on the hidden God, where he uses Isaiah 28 to distinguish when God is doing what he really wants to do, his proper work, and when God is doing what he does not want to do, his alien work. And in this way now he is giving his proper work. And when he gives his proper work, he gives a promise, but Moses is not used to the promise. So when the promise is given, Moses' response is the same response that every pastor who has ever been called on earth gives. I am unworthy. I'm not worthy of this. So the preacher always says, I am not worthy of this office. I cannot be the one who takes this word down to Egypt land and actually bestows and gives it. You have to know that I am not up for this task. According to the law, you should not have chosen me. Nevertheless, God goes precisely through with this plan. Now, if we had more time, we could look at some more details, but you remember that God counters every one of the attempts of Moses to sneak out of his job. His job is to go down and give this promise. Moses doesn't want to give this promise, and he says, I am slow of speech. God says, I know you are. You're a terrible rhetorician. No one would ever want to listen to a sermon of yours. If you tried to start up a parish, wherever it was, it would be unsuccessful. However, I am now going to give this to you in a new kind of way. I'm going to appoint Aaron for you. So when somebody actually has to say these words, we'll let him be the voice for you. You remember how he goes through in each case, and he tells Moses, I'm not letting you out of this. This is going to be your call now. You will be called to become a preacher because it is through the preacher that I want to actually elect my people. This is the way this is going to work. In the same way that it worked for Abraham, the same way it worked for Jacob and so on. They also did not merit this according to the law, but they are nevertheless given it to them by the promise. And in this way, Moses finally had to go. Now, the final strange thing happens to Moses. He has now completed seminary training. He has had his class, which came from the burning bush. It was a very fine class, very good lectures given, and all very succinct, brief. And it came now in the form of the promise. And then the pastor is all set to go. Everything is ready. He knows where his first call is. He's going to go down to Egypt. Now listen to the 4th chapter of Exodus, verse 24. That night, at a lodging place, on the way, the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Well, one of my teachers, some of you know, Gerhard Ferde, used to refer to this as Moses Baccalaureate. There it is. He is ready to be sent out, graduated, sent out as a preacher, and what does God do after he has done all of this work preparing a preacher? He tries to assassinate him. Now, those of you who are preachers know how this works. This is the beginning now of what will be called a bloody husband, because the only one who knows what to do in this situation is his wife. Zipporah now takes matters over, because here she sees that her husband has been prepared for an office that he did not choose or want. Nevertheless, he has been placed in it. And what does God do immediately? He tries to assassinate him. Now, I have my own little theories about this, but the night is getting long, and I can't go on and on about it. I happen to think that Jesus Christ slipped out the back door and decided he was going to take care of Moses and the law once and for all. But that's pure speculation, and I don't want you to go too far on that particular matter. Nevertheless, now there's Moses wondering what has happened. God has called him through the bush, and what's the next thing that happens? God comes down and tries to kill him. Now, Zipporah does the only thing she can think of. She says, get the flint, and I'm now going to circumcise our new son. And she takes now the bloody circumcision and throws it on her husband and says, you are a bloody husband. There you have it. Well, I mean, those of you who are married to pastors know what this is like. I mean, you know how it is that you want to protect them, and you'll do whatever you can. The only thing she can think of is to do what the old story of Abraham said to do. That is, a sign is given to you of the promise that has already been made, the sign of circumcision itself. So she tries it to see if she can protect her husband. And lo and behold, we have no idea what God is doing or why he decides not to kill Moses that night. Nevertheless, he withdrew and did not. Now here, a preacher is always a bloody husband and is operating in blood, as we say. and in this particular way knows that when he is operating with blood, he is not dealing with what lawyers will typically deal with during a day. That's important work. But when you get a preacher now, you are really going to get into the bloody matter of what makes the difference between death and life. And here it is that God is having everything depend upon his particular word. And it is very typical for God to give his word as a promise and then take everything away from you except that word itself. So that seeing and feeling tell you the opposite, but the only thing you're left with is what your ear hears. And what your ear hears now means I have been reduced, like Moses, to nothing but a big ear. That's it. That's all I've got. The same thing happened to Abraham. The same thing happened to Jacob. By the way, the same thing happens to each one that God comes and gives a promise to. Everything else is taken away so that feeling and sight are not the means by which your faith comes, but it is by hearing. So now we go to Romans chapter 10. Fides ex auditu. Faith comes by hearing. Now I can even be a little more refined. Faith comes by hearing a sermon. It comes through a preacher. And the preacher now is the one who has been given in such a way to give you the words that are going to elect you unto eternal life. This is a remarkable matter. And if I didn't know better, I would say that God had just created an insane system. Nevertheless, he proceeds in precisely this way, so that he appoints preachers who will deliver his promise in places no one thought was possible. And in that promise, now he makes an ear that can hear by the power of the Spirit, and in this way he elects and chooses. And all of this is done outside of the law, in what for Moses was a very scary thing. From the bush to the night he was almost assassinated, and nevertheless, this word remains. This is why later on we have to say, as Luther himself says, it is true that Moses for us is the one through whom the law is given. But he is also the first Christian. And in this particular way now, we hear the promise that he had to bestow. And in this way, we begin learning how it is that we have a God who is very strange and is operating in a way that we do not expect, which is entirely outside of the law, and nevertheless, it is precisely the way he wants to deliver this through his bloody husbands who are now sent out in this particular way. And Luther now says, Erasmus, I am your bloody husband now, in such a way that I am going to deliver this particular word to you, and this is what will make you certain, nothing else will. That certainty now is what it means to actually get a preacher. You people have received one. This is a great thing. In such a way now that I am going to be bold and say, even though I don't know you inside and out, I am going to make a guess, and that is that you are actually a sinner. In such a way now that you actually need to receive a word. You first received it in baptism, and if you have not yet received your baptism, then why not? We'll give it to you right here and now if you need it. But when you receive this promise, I do for you exactly what Luther did for Erasmus. I acquit your heart of all that is afraid of this God and the way he is going to operate with you. I absolve and forgive you in such a way that you can be released, so that the Spirit, in fact, can give this promise to you through a preacher. And when you have a preacher, your whole entire life has not been changed. It is free, and it is eternal. Amen.